Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, the Honorable our lecturer, Ms. Ria Yunita MPD, and all my beloved friends. We are from Group 6. Let me introduce our group. My name is Rafi Arlintio, and my partner is Nazhif Alfaqih Ahmad. So, in this video, we are going to discuss about assessing learning from interactions. Now, the first material will be explained by me. An overview of assessment learning from instruction. Team events. Just finished teaching a workshop for trainers in state agencies on creating effective visuals. He had some admirable objectives for his workshops, such as the following. First, give a description of the audience, characteristic, purpose of the presentations, and source materials. The learner will be able to develop a transparency master that incorporates the principle of visual design and good lettering. And the second, give a description of the audience characteristics, purpose of the presentation, and a handout developed for a presentation. The learner will be able to evaluate the handout based upon the principle of visual design, effective lettering, and appropriate use of the medium, and to suggest revisions. In this chapter, we will address many of the issues related to assessment within an instructional design context. Next, purpose of evaluation. As Major 1962 states, the question that instructional designer asks in addition to where are we going and how we will get there is how do we know when we're there? Planning for evaluation allows us to determine how we know when we're there. Evaluate serve two purposes in instructional design. First, to assess individual student performance, and to provide information about what kinds of revisions are needed in the instructional design materials. Sequencing assessment design activity. We have choose to sequence designing assessment items immediately after writing learning objectives. A good designer generally begins to think about assessment instrument as she develops the learning objectives. This done to help ensure that assessment matches the objectives. For example, the condition and actions specific in the objective are considered in the writing of each assessment item. This is why the stage for writing test items appears where it does in the design model. There is a definite benefit to write assessment items immediately after writing objective. The first is the intentions of the objective will be fresh in your mind, and if you can write an item for the objective, then you will know what you may have to re-examine your objective. Thus, a good time to write test item is immediately after writing objective. When designing assessment item for a lesson, you should do the following. First, identify the purpose of the assessment instrument and the type of model that will be followed in this development. And the second, determine what kinds of assessment are necessary and where they should occur in the instructional strategy. And the third, determine what forms the item should take. Performance test, essay, multiple choice, portfolio, and so on. To adequately assess the type of learning that is represented by the objective. And fourth, write test items and directions that are clear to the learner, originally in the form of item specification. And the last, determine how to select among objectives are what proportions proportion of objectives should appear on the assessment instrument by writing an instrument blueprint. Next, purpose and model of assessment of learner achievement. In educational and training environments, there are two rather diverse reasons for assessing learners' achievement. First, to determine level of competence and to compare or rank learners' abilities. One example of an assessment of competence is a performance assessment designed to determine whether a physical therapist can correctly adjust the height of crutches. The scores from this assessment might enable the instructor to determine which learners are ready for further study and which learners need more instructions on the topic. The information provided by this assessment might also be used by licensing or accrediting agency to determine whether an individual has the skill or knowledge to be licensed or accredited. Next, assessment. There are three types of assessment. The first is skill assessment. Skill assessment, this test can be given priority to the instructional lessons in combination with the pretest or as a way of reviewing the prerequisite skills. And the second is pre-assessment. A designer may design pre-assessment so that the supervising instruction can terminate the assessment if learners have evidence that they cannot answer the items related to the new information to be learned. And the last, post-assessment. Ideally, a post-assessment will assess whether the learner can achieve both the enabling objective and the terminal objective of a lesson. Although tests that assess both enabling the terminal objective can be time-consuming to write, they provide a great deal of useful information. Next, characteristic of good assessment instrument. Good criterion reference assessment instrument have several necessary qualities. There is validity, reliability, and practicality. Validity. An assessment instrument is valid if it actually assesses or measures what it claims to assess or measure. For objective-based assessment instruments, an instrument is valid if, first, its individual items are consistent with the goals or objective they claim to assess. And second, the items for its objective are representative of the range of items that are possible to develop for that objective. And third, objectives upon which the instrument is based are adequately sampled. And reliability. An assessment instrument is reliable if they consistently measure what it claims to measure, and if we have a high degree of confidence in the score that it produces. We would like to be able to say with confidence that learners who achieve a high score on an assessment are competent and learners who score poorly are not competent. There are a number of factors that can lead to this error. The lack of objectivity of an instrument can cause it to be unreliable. For example, an instrument that cannot be objectively graded can lead to errors in grading that makes its measure unreliable. And the last is practicality. The optimal assessment might be a many-item, contrasted responses or performance exam that is as close as possible to the real-life situation, in which the learners will apply their knowledge. For all objectives, with a carefully developed set of criteria of evaluating the responses. However, generally there is a trade-off between our desire to create a valid and reliable test and the realities of the assessment situations. An ideal assessment for this objective would be the complete design of several courses for varying situations to ensure a valid and reliable measure of competence. Okay, I think that's all for me. And the next explanation will be explained by Nazhif. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nazhif Alfaqih Ahmad. I will continue explaining the material that I have explained before. The next is trade-offs in assessment design. We must make carefully considered decisions as to which factors are most important for the particular assessment situation, and then make trade-offs among the factors of validity, reliability, and practicality. One of the bases upon which these trade-offs may be made is the consequences of the wrong decisions that might be made with a less than ideal assessment. The assessment is not ideally reliable because it really has an insufficient number of items to allow the instructor to conclude that the learner will be able to design for a variety of situations. In an attempt to compensate for this lack of items, the instructor might create printed scenarios in which the learners complete one part of the design process, or the instructor might develop situations in which the learner must evaluate and revise fully already created portions of a design project. This reduces the validity of the assessment as it doesn't match the conditions of the stated objective. The next is formats for assessment. There are two types of formats for assessment. They are performance assessments and the other one is pencil and paper assessment forms. The first is performance assessments. The types of assessments that have been included in this category are observation of on-the-job performance, simulations, essays, portfolios, evaluation of performance assessments. Whereas in pencil and paper assessment forms, pencil and paper tests can be designed in three different forms. First is recall items, second is recognition items, and the last is constructed answer items. Now we go to response characteristics of recognition items. In describing responses to recognition items, the designer must outline the characteristics of the correct answer to be selected, which is relatively easy, and the incorrect answers, which is much more difficult. In describing the correct answers, it is often possible to actually list the entire pool of possible correct answers that could be assessed, such as on an instrument evaluating learners' ability to select a correct aperture size for a certain exposure. Next is response characteristics of production items. The response characteristics for a recall or constructed answer have a different set of problems. It is fairly easy to specify the form that the answer should take. It may be difficult, however, to specify the characteristics of a correct response. There are 6 points to specify the characteristics of a correct response. The first is objective, second is sample item, third is question form, question characteristics, response characteristics, and the last one is number of items and mastery criteria. Now we go to assessment instrument blueprints. You have created item specifications that outline the characteristics of items to assess individual objectives, but an assessment instrument typically evaluates learners' performance on more than one objective. Therefore, the assessment designer must consider all the item specifications together and define the entire instrument. This plan is sometimes called as an instrument blueprint. There are 8 components of blueprint. They are objectives, forms of items, total number of items in instrument, proportionality of items, directions for administration, scoring methods, weighting of items, and the last one is passing or cut-off level. While the next is number of items. The first factor to consider is the total number of items for the instrument. You may need to determine the number of written items, the number of simulation experiences, the number of on-the-job observations, or the total of items combined. You have already identified the number of items that you have determined to adequately assess each individual objective. Next is proportionality of items. The percentage of items that come from each objective is closely related to the total number of items. Assigning a greater proportion of items to specific objective in one way to give attention to the more critical objectives in a unit or course. We do not recommend this practice because sampling across objectives implies that all objectives are of equal importance. As we have pointed out earlier, this is generally not true. If you must fully sample from possible items within a single objective, or purposefully sample from the objectives themselves. Okay, the next is directions. Directions may also include cautions to notice particular instructions within the instrument and explanation how response should be reported. Direction to administrators may provide information as to how to respond to the students' questions, how to set up the assessment area, what materials are needed during the assessment, time length, or other information that may be necessary to ensure the reliability, validity, or particularity of the assessment. Okay, now we go on scoring methods. At this point, however, you have fulfilled your specifications and have actual sample items for your objectives. This is the point at which you can create your scoring key. This key may be a simple template for items such as multiple choice and true-false items, or it may need to be as complete and detailed as possible to alleviate errors scoring other forms of items such as on-the-job observation, simulations, and essay items. The next is weighting of items. Another way to have weight to items for the more critical objectives is to value those individual items more in scoring than some other items. This is often done by making certain items worth more than others on the assessment. This is a legitimate practice, but if it is followed, it is important that the values for all items on the instrument be identified for the students as they take the test. Okay, the next is passing or cut-off score. At this point, you may wish to assign or suggest a passing or mastery criterion for the entire test. Instructional designers have been known to use the 10 per edit criterion. While this standard may be appropriate in some text, it is often inappropriate. And the last point that we have to discuss in this video is constructing assessment items. There are 3 types of assessments were discussed. First is entry skills, to see what learners are ready for their instruction. The second is pre-assessment, to see what learners already know of the material to be taught. And the last is post-assessment, to see what learners learned from instruction. Well, thank you very much for watching, and thank you for your great attention. From our explanation, anybody would like to ask? Okay, the last I'd say, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.